Om Namah Shivaya, everyone, and welcome. This is our third webinar on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We are going to start where we left off. One moment, please. Very good. We left off in chapter 2, verse 22, which is what's on the screen. So we're going to do that verse again just to give us continuity. Although what is seen ceases to exist for him whose purpose has been accomplished, it is nevertheless not ceased to exist altogether for others. It remains the common experience. That one is self-evident, of course, which means the world is there as your experience until you transcend it, and then for the individual who has transcended it, it's no longer there. Verse 23. The identity of the seer with the seen is the reason that the essential form of the power of the owner is perceived to be that of the owned. So this idea we saw before, it's just being presented here with the word power added. So it's not just the form of the owner, the essential form of the owner, but the essential form of the power of the owner, which shows that awareness has a power to it. So the essential form of the power of awareness is perceived to be that of the owned. Paraphrased, we think we're a person, a personality, and the power of our pure soul nature is assigned to our personality. And eventually we need to detach that power from the personality and reclaim it in its pure form. This identity is caused by ignorance. Ignorance here is avidya, and as we explained before, it doesn't mean ignorance in the normal sense, where we don't know something. We bought a new computer and we're ignorant about how to operate it, and we just have to read the manual. And when we read the manual, we learn how to operate it, and we're no longer ignorant about how it works. This is ignorance in the sense of mistaking one thing for the other. The common example given is in a darkened street, you see something, it's actually a rope, but you think it's a snake. So it's ignorance in the sense of perceiving one thing, perceiving something as something else. So in this case, we were perceiving the power of awareness to be the power of our personality. We're misperceiving something because of our ignorance. We'll skip that question opportunity. Verse 25. With the disappearance of that ignorance, the identity also disappears. This is total cessation, the aloneness, kaivalya, of the power of awareness. So kaivalya gets translated as absolute oneness, aloneness, perfect detachment, freedom, and of course is Patanjali's word for the state of moksha. Awareness, instead of being hooked up to consciousness, stands all by itself in a permanent way. That's kaivalya. Well, this is the first verse to give a description of what happens to awareness when it no longer identifies with the seen, which is that the power of awareness is alone. Verse 26. The means of attaining cessation is the unceasing vision of discernment. Viveka Kyati, vision of discernment. Well, this is a verse that's giving us a method, practice for achieving Kaivalya, which is the unceasing discrimination as to the difference between the seer and the seen. So when the seer no longer identifies with the seen, then we have the state we're striving for. For one, with this unceasing vision of discernment, there arises in the last stage wisdom that is sevenfold. Well, Patanjali's verses don't describe the wisdom that is sevenfold. Everyone's supposed to know what it is. But all the commentators go in at great length, and I didn't want to give all of that material because it's just in the commentary. It's not in the verses. But I thought one commentator, the most famous one, Vyasa, I thought I'd just mention his seventh one. In the seventh state, the insight reveals Purusha abiding in itself, pure and alone. Well, that's obviously where we should end up. Purusha is pure and alone. No relationship at all to Prakriti. Verse 28. When the limbs of yoga are practiced, impurities dwindle and radiant knowledge manifests, leading up to the vision of discernment. Well, this is a very important verse. First of all, it's the first verse that talks about the limbs of yoga. You can see it there in the first two words, yoga anga. Anga is the word for limb, like a tree branch. An anga, a limb. So the limbs of yoga, when they're practiced, three things happen, not just one. Three events happen. So this is really important information. First, impurities dwindle. Second, radiant knowledge manifests. Third, the ability to discriminate between the seer and the seen manifests. So three-step process. We need purification because it's the impurities in the mind that prevent us from these deeper realizations. So we have to clean them out. And how do we clean them out? The practice of the limbs of yoga. When we do that sufficiently, then we have radiant knowledge. And when we have enough radiant knowledge, we have the vision of discernment, the difference between Purusha and Prakriti. The 8 limbs of yoga are yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So we're all familiar with the standard 8 limbs of yoga. And of course, because there's 8 limbs, one of the names for Patanjali's classical yoga is also Ashtanga yoga, or the yoga of 8 limbs. Verse 30. The yamas are non-injury, truthfulness, non-stealing, divine conduct, and non-covetousness. So, of course, we know the yamas are the ethical restraints, and these are the necessary foundation. Without doing the foundation, which is level 1, then the rest won't work. We're all familiar with Gurudeva's teachings, in which there are 10 yamas, and the difference is over time in the scriptures in India, the 5 yamas became 10. And so we say in the Yoga Upanishads, such as Sandilya, the yamas have expanded to 10, and it's the list of 10 from the Yoga Upanishads that we use. Verse 31. These are valid in all spheres, irrespective of birth status, place, time, or circumstance, and constitute the great vow. So Patanjali is using the word jati, social rank or status of a person's birth, occupational status, so we've rendered that as birth status, a very general term, meaning it applies to everybody. Doesn't matter what your social status is in Hinduism, it applies to you. It doesn't apply just to Brahmins, just to Vaishyas, it applies to everybody. Irrespective of place, time, or circumstance. That means we're supposed to be doing it all the time. There's no exceptions, no places, times, or circumstances where we're not supposed to follow these. And therefore they constitute the great vow, or Mahavrata. Verse 32, the niyamas are purity, contentment, austerity, self-study, and devotion to Ishvara. So, of course, niyama, as we know, are the religious observances. And again, in Patanjali's system, there's only 5 of them. And again, by the Yoga Upanishads, a few centuries later, they've expanded to 10, which is the list that we use. For the repelling of unwholesome deliberation, its opposite should be cultivated. So I created 2 examples to help understand that one. Unwholesome deliberation means a thought that it's negative or potentially harmful, something we don't want to have, an unwholesome deliberation. The first idea is to replace the idea of harming someone with negative words with the idea of helping them through encouraging words. So we put the opposite thought in our mind, and that will cancel out the negative one. The second idea is replacing the idea of coveting what another has by finding a way to give something to them, such as through hospitality. So those are both effective ways of repelling or canceling out an unwholesome deliberation. Verse 34. Unwholesome deliberations, such as harming someone and so forth, whether done, caused to be done, or approved, whether arising from greed, anger, or infatuation, whether modest, medium, or extreme, find their unending fruition in ignorance and suffering. This is why one must cultivate their opposites. Well, this is very interesting. Usually when karma is thought about, it is in the context of an individual performing an action. And because the individual performed the action, it causes a negative karma or a positive karma in the future. However, this verse points out the subtleties that even if you don't perform the act yourself, but have caused others to do it, or even approved others to do it, that also creates a reaction in the future. Oh, that's very interesting. It's not just the person who ends up doing it, it's everybody who is involved in the process of creating the action and approving the action. Verse 35. For those grounded in non-injury, in their presence, others can let go of their hostility. So Patanjali is going to give a benefit for performing each of the yamas and the niyamas, kind of a reason to do it. And the benefit is usually quite clear, so I won't comment on it. For those grounded in truthfulness, action and its fruition depend on them. This one isn't quite clear. My understanding is the idea here is that the power of truthfulness makes easier the successful completion of a course of action. So if you're truthful, totally truthful, then it's easier for success to manifest. Verse 37, for those grounded in non-stealing, all kinds of wealth comes to them. Again, the benefit is clear. For those grounded in divine conduct, which of course is the translation of brahmacharya, great vitality is acquired. So we know that. That's in Gurudeva's teachings, how the energy stays within and stimulates intellectual and even intuitive areas of the mind. For those settled in non-covetousness, knowledge comes of the wherefore of their birth. That means knowledge of past births would arise. We have our first question period, and we have 2 questions that came in previously on email. Take a look here. Kushantan asks, in the first pada, how does an individual move from the focus of an external object to taking the object out of time and space? Well, taking the object out of time and space, the comment also goes on to say it's the same idea as becoming the object. It would happen naturally when you get absorbed into it deeply enough, then it's a natural process. That you're so focused on the object, you're not really aware of its relationship to time and space anymore. It's just an object. So I'd say it just goes because you've deepened your meditation on it. Ushadeva Guhan asks, how does the undifferentiate relate to Sat Chit Ananda? Well, fortunately it doesn't, because if it did, it would be hard to explain. But the undifferentiate, the simplest way, it's not really accurate, but the simplest way is if you take a lump of clay and call that the undifferentiate. And then from the clay, you take certain amounts and you make the objects. And then at the end, you put those objects back into the lump of clay. So the lump of clay is the undifferentiate, from which all things are drawn. Of course, they're not all of the same subtlety of vibration. That's the flaw in that explanation, because some are more subtle than the other, and in this case, they're all the same. But it does give you the sense that the undifferentiate means the pile of clay. There's no object there. Nothing has been made of it. It's just the original source material from which specific objects, which differentiate themselves from one another, can be built. So with that, we can open up to new questions. Anybody have a question? We had problems with this last time, so we'll make sure we've got it all straight in our technology. My screen says send to host. I'm not sure if it should, but that's how it's reading at the bottom. Oh, there we go. Ushadeva and Kamala, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, your picture's not there, but your voice is, which is good enough to ask a question.
This question is from me, Kamala.
Now I can see you.
Okay.
Om Namah Shivaya.
One question was left over from last time that it had to do with tapas and making a sacrifice. And one of the ways that we could sacrifice is a sacrifice of intelligence. And I didn't quite know what that meant. And I wondered if Satguru could say something about that.
Sacrifice of intelligence. I'm not quite sure of that phrase.
Oh, it was along with, as a means of tapas, a person could sacrifice time or
Yes.
cherished object or intelligence, and was one of the words.
No, it shouldn't have been intelligence. My standard example for sacrifice, and you compare it to charity. So charity, you take $10 out of your wallet or purse and you give it to a charitable cause. Pretty simple. Certain punyam involved. Sacrifice takes it a step further. You deny yourself something to save $10. So you instead of going out to dinner, which you usually do on Tuesday night, you stay home and cook a meal, and then you take the money you saved and give it. So that you've denied yourself something, which is a deeper process and therefore constitutes a form of tapas. That makes sense?
Yes.
It's self-denial, but it has nothing to do with intelligence. And I never used that example. The other one is the budget vacation. Those are the only two examples I use. Does that clarify it?
I'll have to think about it.
Okay, yeah, nothing to do with intelligence. You
Okay.
can't sacrifice intelligence.
Okay. May I ask one more
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
What does non-covetousness, how does that relate to the 10 yamas that we are familiar with? Which one is it?
Well, Gurudeva combined non-stealing and non-covetousness as one.
Okay.
So in his explanation, I think it's Apivarga, is it? Is that the one? Non-covetousness? I think it's Apivarga, something like that, close to that. He says how coveting leads to stealing. That we see someone with a fancy computer, fancier than we can afford, and if we think about that enough, it can motivate us to steal it. So that excessive desire for something that someone else has that we can't afford can lead to stealing. So he puts the two together in our system. So sometimes they're split apart and sometimes they're put together. Okay, well, thank you very much for those questions. Wonderful chatting with you.
Nice to see you.
Sarvana Swami's going back to his computer and he will see if there's another question. So he turned up the volume. That's what he was busy doing. If the volume is still low now and then, please let us know. We have a really big microphone here and there's no reason the volume should be low. Okay, let's see if there's another question. Okay, we'll go on then. Verse 40. Purity of one's own limbs brings bodily detachment and the desire for freedom from physical contact with others. Again, he's going through the each of the yamas and showing the benefit. So we become more detached from the body. Verse 41. Furthermore, one achieves a purification of the sattvic nature, gladness, one-pointedness, mastery of the sense organs, and fitness for Atma Darshana. So sattvic, of course, is sattva guna, which in our lexicon we define as perfection of being, the quality of goodness or purity. So it's the state of prakriti. It's the most refined or spiritual. So that gets purified. Contentment brings unsurpassed joy, verse 42. Benefit we're familiar with. If we can be content, then we are joyful. Verse 43. Through austerity, due to the dwindling of impurity, perfection of the body and its sense organs is acquired. So that's again a form of purity. Verse 44, through self-study, communion is established with one's chosen deity. So this is very interesting, because the religious side, the devotional side of Patanjali's yoga is usually not presented in modern times. Now, this is talking about something as if it was a text on devotion. Ishta Devata. Ishta, chosen, Devata, deity. Samprayoga, communion. Through self-study, communion is established with one's chosen deity. So self-study is the term Patanjali uses in the later expansion. It's Siddhanta Shravana and Japa. So Siddhanta Shravana, scriptural study, and Japa. So clearly, if you do Japa to a specific deity, it establishes communication or connection. So that's what's being pointed out here. And verse 45, through devotion to Ishvara, samadhi is attained. So again, that's not stressed in modern teachings of Patanjali's yoga, that we need the devotion to the personal God, Ishvara, helps us achieve samadhi. Samadhi is not separate from the path of devotion. So what that means is that effort and dedication can be supplemented by the blessings or grace we receive due to our intense devotion to God. In other words, it's not just the devotion to God, it's that the devotion to God opens an individual to receiving God's blessings, God's grace. And it's the grace that transforms you, or the blessings that transform you. It's a two-step process. The more devotion you have, the more open you are to grace. So the more blessings you're able to receive, which in this case can help you to move towards samadhi. In other words, we see that in the temple, the amount of grace we can receive during a puja is limited by the amount of devotion we can feel toward the deity. If we don't feel any devotion, we won't feel any grace. And if we're really, really deeply involved in devotion, then we receive a lot of the grace, or maybe all of the grace that's possible to receive during that ceremony. Verse 46, asana, posture, should be steady and comfortable. My comment, one's meditation posture is directly related to how deep one's meditation is. It is important to take time to find a posture that is comfortable. Once that has been achieved, then it is important to remain as motionless throughout the meditation as possible. So first we need a posture that's comfortable, and then we try not to move. Steady means we don't move around. We try not to move the body. And the more successful we are at that, then the deeper our meditation can be. Each time we significantly move, David used to explain that we're kind of starting over. We externalize ourselves. If we move significantly, not just a teeny bit, but if we move significantly, we're kind of starting over, and it takes us a while to get back to where we were. Verse 47, this occurs through relaxing effort and samapati upon the infinite. So my comment is, ananta samapati, meaning samapati on the infinite, is described as feeling you have the qualities of infinite space. that you extend out beyond your physical body into the surrounding environment, and then beyond that. That is the visualization to focus on, while at the same time simply relaxing. So that gives you a sense what the verse is about. Verse 48. Thence comes imperturbation by the pairs of opposites. That's an English word we don't usually use. Thence comes imperturbation by the pairs of opposites. Anabhigata, being beyond disturbance. For my comment, once properly established in asana, the meditator is no longer affected by conditions such as heat or cold. This relates to the soon-to-come practice of pratyahara, which is more effective if the body is properly relaxed. When this is achieved, pranayama can be practiced, in which between inhalation and exhalation, breathing is suspended. Comment. This refers to inhaling and delaying the subsequent exhalation, as well as exhaling and then delaying the subsequent inhalation. So we do things like that sometimes. Verse 50. In pranayama, the movement patterns are exhalation, inhalation, and lull. These, when observed as to time, number, and area of focus, become long and subtle. In other words, when we regulate the breath as to the length of the inhalation, the number of them, and we focus on different areas, we can make the whole process long, which means the breathing is slower and more subtle. Verse 51. The fourth kind of pranayama is that which transcends regular. The idea here is that when we practice regulating for some time, say 5 or 10 minutes, we can reach a state where the breath becomes self-regulating. We maintain what we're doing, but we don't have to think about it. It doesn't require conscious control. If we move to doing something else with our mind, the breath keeps going in the same regulated way. (52) Thence the covering of the inner light disappears. Prakasha avaranam, inner light veil. Comment. The practice of pranayama internalizes the yogi enough so that the inner light that is always there is visible. We don't have to create inner light. It's there. It's just that there's something blocking our vision. There's a veil. The veil can be caused by impurities, in which case it takes a while to clear them by the previous practices, or it can just be mental activity, in which case by taking the meditation to this point through pranayama, the mental activity is subdued enough that we can see the inner light that's always there. Verse 53, and the mind becomes fit for dharana. My comment, the inner light is a signpost that the mind is sufficiently internalized that the practice of concentration will come easily. Verse 54. Pratyahara is when the sense organs withdraw from external objects and imitate, as it were, the nature of the mind. Well, pratyahara is something we're actually very familiar with. It happens in a modified form when we go to sleep every night. We withdraw from the senses, so we're no longer aware of what's around us. We don't hear objects. We don't hear activities, for example. We don't feel things. But we're not conscious. We're asleep. Well, pratyahara is to do the same thing, but to stay awake. But it gives us a good example of how we're trying to shut down the senses. Verse 55. From that follows supreme self-control of the sense organs. This verse is pointing out that the practice of pratyahara not only causes the senses to close off, but gives the yogi self-control over them as well. Okay, we can open up again for questions. Okay, well, we'll keep going then. Getting into chapter 3. I'll watch my head here. Chapter 3 is called Vibhuti Pada. And Vibhuti has a different meaning than we're used to. Doesn't have any relationship to Holy Ash. It means paranormal power. It's going through some of the unusual powers, or siddhis, we usually call them, that can result in yoga, as well as its finishing up, first of all, on the limbs of yoga. Verse 1. Dharana is the binding of the mind to a single object. Comment. When the mind's focus on a single object is uninterrupted and sustained, that is dharana, or concentration. Well, that's the first step of directing the thoughts in a conscious way with yourself as the instigator of it, dharana, concentration. Verse 2, dhyana is an unbroken flow of thought toward that object. This is nice material from the commentators on that. They say, the process of meditation is often compared to the pouring of oil from one vessel to another in a steady, unbroken stream. In dharana, the flow of knowledge can be compared to a succession of similar drops of water. In dhyana, the flow of knowledge is continuous, like the pouring of oil from one vessel to another in a steady, unbroken stream. So again, how do we get from dharana to dhyana, from concentration to meditation? We just go more deeply into the object. We get drawn into what we're concentrating on more, and it's a natural transition. So of course it helps if what you're concentrating on in the first place you have an interest in. Verse 3. When that practice results in the mind being as if empty of its own form and the object of meditation alone shining forth, it is samadhi. See what my comment is. When the state of meditation becomes so deep that only the object stands by itself, obliterating, as it were, all traces of reflective thought, it is known as samadhi. So this is the lower form of samadhi. Object of meditation alone shining forth. So previously we were thinking about an object. Now we've gotten so deeply involved in the object that we are the object. We're not thinking about it. We're just understanding it by being it. Verse 4, the practice of these three together on the same object is samyama. My comment, the idea of practicing together is to first start with dharana on the chosen object. This will eventually lead to dhyana, which will finally lead to samadhi. So it's a natural 1, 2, 3 process in terms of going more deeply into the object of concentration. Verse 5, the mastery of samyama yields the flashing forth of prajna. So prajna is wisdom attained in the state of samadhi and flashing forth aloka. My comment, prajna refers to wisdom obtained from being in the state of samadhi. It is quite distinct from knowledge gained by inference or from tradition. It is based on direct perception, sakshatkara. So it's intuition. Simple word is something coming forth from intuition. Knowledge is coming forth from intuition rather than our intellect, rather than from our memory or reason. Patanjali calls prajna. Verse 6, its practice is to be mastered in stages. So again, you only find out what the stages are in the commentators, and one of them says there's 4 stages, beginning with the objects of knowledge, but because it's in the commentators and not in the sutras itself, I haven't developed it. Verse 7, these 3 are the inner limbs in relation to the previous 5. The previous 5, of course, are yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, and pratyahara. And they all involve external foundational practices, doing something external. Requires movement, breathing. Something external is involved in those 5, and now these 3 are just totally inside, so they're inner. Verse 8, yet they are outer limbs in relation to the objectless samadhi. So we haven't reached the most subtle area yet. Objectless is also called asamprajñata, meaning it's transcending intuition, it's transcending insight. This is a very interesting area. See if we can present it clearly. Verse 9. The externalizing samskaras are subjugated by employing restraint, which in turn manifests new samskaras. This is called nirodha parinama, restraint transformation, which occurs whenever restraint is employed. So subjugate, English word to bring under complete control. Parinama, transformation. Vyuttana, externalizing. See what my commentary is. This is similar to the idea at the end of chapter 1, which focused on the samskaras generated in nirvichara samadhi. This is more general in saying that whenever restraint is employed, new samskaras are generated which subjugate the externalizing ones. But why it's hard to sit and meditate is the externalizing samskaras, meaning memories of past events, want us to get up and do something. I should be doing this, I should be doing that. The externalizing samskaras are causing it very hard to even sit there. But what this is saying is by controlling the mental activities, we're putting new samskaras into the subconscious. That is a new activity, and that activity is being remembered. And it changes the content of the subconscious. So we're reducing the tendency of the externalizing samskaras to want us to do something and want us to think about external activities just by the simple practice of controlling our thoughts. Therefore, we can see it's a slow process depending on what our externalizing samskaras are. It's a slow process to subjugate them or change the contents of the subconscious mind, which is also called samskara chitta. It's the subconscious mind, the mind which contains the samskaras. Verse 10, a tranquil flow of consciousness is produced by these restraint samskaras. My comment, restraint samskaras influence the mind to be without mental activity and therefore remain in a tranquil state. So that, of course, is the challenge. To be content to be without mental activity. We're not raised that way. The modern world kind of goes against that and constantly flooding us with mental activity. I always see that when I travel. You get up in the morning, you go to the hotel exercise room, and there's television going. You go down to the breakfast cafe, and they have these two televisions blasting at you. Sometimes even when you check into your hotel room, they've already turned the television on. It's hard to get away from it. We're constantly bombarded with information, and therefore we tend to constantly think. To learn to sit without thought and be content without thought is what this is talking about. And that's achieved by simply generating restraint samskaras by practicing meditation. Well, why don't we open up for questions there? Getting close to the 1 hour mark. See if we have any questions on that. Okay, you're back. Back to demand. Your last performance was a success. Repeat demand.
I was Om Shivaya. What I was wondering is why it is so often mentioned the need to transcend pairs of opposites. What is it in our minds that, is it kind of like a pendulum? It just keeps moving from one to the other in our thoughts, or?
Yes, in that we tend to think, we tend to look at the opposites in the world and get influenced by them. In the sense of it changes our perspective. Whereas our perspective should be constant, regardless of which portion of the opposite we're experiencing. Simple opposite is success and failure. We're a salesman. 2 days ago, we were very successful. We had lots of sales. Yesterday, we didn't have any sales. So how do we feel at the end of the day? Well, we get too elated by the success and we get too depressed by the lack of success. Our perspective is getting changed on a day-to-day basis. So we're getting influenced by the pairs of opposites that we're not holding a constant viewpoint by being detached enough from them. You can't, a salesman can't be successful every single day, but we tend to think we should be. Does that make sense? So we want to be constant in our perspective, in our contentment, in our detachment, regardless of which side of the opposite we're experiencing. Not get overly elated by one side and overly depressed by the other. But we do that by being detached enough. In Gurudeva's teachings, we have a mountaintop consciousness, so we can look down on it more in detachment. So the verse is really saying we need to be detached from the external world enough to hold a constant inner viewpoint, regardless of if we're successful or not in a particular day, as a simple example.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Not right now.
Okay. Thank you for being the source of questions. Okay, we got a confirmation that that was useful. That's good. Okay, we have Sunny Alahan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, you can go ahead and ask your question. And
Okay. I was wondering, as we're studying Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, how does samadhi relate to hearing a high E, or as he describes it, and then as Gurudeva describes high E? Is that synonymous with samadhi?
well, if you're totally, samadhi means being one with. I mean, that's the essence of it, is you, as the verses were explaining, the movement from dharana to dhyana to samadhi, meaning the lower stages of samadhi, it's a gradual progression. The samadhi stage is when you are the high E. Dharana and dhyana stages precede that. So if you're thinking about it, there's a high E in my head, and the high E is a result of the friction between the odic and the actinic force. And if I hear it above my left ear and better than my right, and then it blending in the middle, that's not samadhi. But you're hearing the high E, right?
Mm.
So that's more dharana on the high E. Dhyana is a continuous flow of thought, so you're more perceiving it in a steady, consistent way, as that, the example of the flow of oil from one vessel to another. There's a steady flow of perception of it, but you're still perceiving it. The samadhi is when you perceiving it has gone away and there's just the high E. You are the high E and you're not perceiving it. So when you become the object of concentration, that's the lower form of samadhi. So that can be done on the high E, definitely, but it has to be to that depth. Otherwise, it's either dharana or dhyana. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Well, that was a good question. I think you catalyzed a useful answer, I think.
Thank you.
It looks like we have a question one more question there. Yes. Okay, Janaka and Bhavani, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Please Ask your question.
Well, see if I can articulate it. You had one of the verses earlier that was kind of a mouthful about restraining the outgoing of sense.
The samskaras?
Samskaras, and yes, and
Subjugating the external samskaras with the nirodhana samskaras, right?
yes, and I have a question that's related to it's two parts. One is while I'm awake, and the other is while I'm trying to go to sleep. So that's the same area. Now, when I'm awake, sometimes I feel like, you know, I have maybe have withdrawn from going to external samskaras, but I want to be sure I'm not just in a dullard state.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know for sure how to distinguish. And then when I'm going to sleep, sometimes I'll work at trying to have that blank mind, but then I have often experienced sort of struggling to make it go blank, and in the process, it seems like it's got me so activated I can't go to sleep.
Sure, it wasn't too much coffee. Okay. Well, the first one would be meditation is dynamic. There should be a dynamism involved. There, your picture's there. There should be a dynamism involved to call it meditation and not just kind of a sleepy afternoon state of mind, you know, where you're not thinking a lot, but you're not really dynamic. Meditation is dynamic. So the quiet should be there. But when the mind is restrained, nirodhana, restrained, you should feel dynamic. Like you could get up and you know, do something for the next half hour. You're charged with energy, and you're just holding the energy in. But you're in an energetic state. That make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And if you're not in an energetic state, then it's not really that.
Okay.
And then the other one can just relate to too much intellectual stimulation before you go to bed, but don't want to, you know, solve math problems or something the half hour before you're trying to go to sleep. That is a silly example, but you know, you don't want to engage the intellect in something that's going to keep it going, because the intellect doesn't turn off instantaneously. It tends to wind down slowly. So you want to be careful not to do something too intellectually challenging right before you go to sleep. And that could help.
Is there any fruition in trying to make one's mind blank while going to sleep, or is that more of an intellectual thing to be doing?
After you've lain down to go to sleep?
Yes.
Yes, I think so. But it's just a letting go of areas of concern, areas of responsibility that you're going to have to face the next day. You just have to kind of let them go and say, you know, I did enough today. You know, I'll face you all tomorrow.
Yeah, that's good.
And, you know, it's that making an appointment with yourself kind of idea that we can, if we say that this can wait till tomorrow, just go away, then that can help it go away.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the good question.
Here.
Okay, see if there's a last question. We're getting close to the end. Our time slot. Well, we don't have any questions at the moment, so just to make a few comments on what we covered. As I alluded to twice, that the idea that the element of devotion to Ishvara, the personal God, is an important part of Patanjali's approach to yoga is not usually stressed. Because then that brings up the whole question in a non-Hindu setting of, well, who is Ishvara? And then that's the Hindu concept of the personal God, which is certainly different than the Western religion's concept of the personal God. But it's important, and it's right there. It's saying devotion to Ishvara is what gives you samadhi. And when we look at round two will bring in Gurudeva's teachings and really click more and generate more questions, because it'll be more familiar material. We'll start seeing what Gurudeva says about that. Gurudeva is, in his own way, he scolds, he says there's no way you can achieve samadhi without the grace of the deity. It's just not even possible. So it shows that meditation involves theism or devotional practice as well in the traditional formation, which is traditional classical yoga. Very much involves devotion to God being cultivated before we sit down for deep meditation. And that's, of course, what the idea of the niyamas encompasses. The yamas, ethical restraints, but then the niyamas take us from the ethical restraints into the religious practices, which in our terminology is easier to remember. Siddhanta Shravana, the scriptural study, japa, the mantra, and Ishvara Pujana, where we do the puja. Whereas this is Ishvara Pranidhana, which is the devotion. Same idea, just a little more specific and familiar to us, that we need to have these basics in place. I have a talk on that. I gave that to the Golden Gate Mission. You'll remember the 3 kinds of temples, which is actually Saiva Siddhanta in disguise. 3 kinds of temples. The first one is called the Pura Mandira, the village temple, which is Charya. The second one is Graha Mandira, which is the home shrine, which is Kriya. And then the third one is the Atma Mandira, which is the body, which is yoga. So Charya, Kriya, Yoga. It shows that we're supposed, in Siddhanta, we start by attending the local temple. But when we get really good at that, when we feel close to the deity, when we have a sense of devotion, we're supposed to take it the next step and become the pujari in our home shrine. And doing the puja offers a much deeper experience, or a much greater chance to get close to God than simply attending it. So we start doing the puja, the external puja, which is the idea of the niyamas in Patanjali. And then that leads to meditation. So that's meditating in the temple of the body, the Atma Mandira. So we're not supposed to stop at the first one or even the second one. We're supposed to go all the way to the third one. And that's what Patanjali has in his system. It's not mapped out in its fullness, as nothing is. These are very terse verses, but it's mapped out in its fullness in the Saiva Siddhanta system. So thank you very much for attending. We'll have our next session in roughly 2 months. Om Namah Shivaya.